Hello, everybody. I think most of you know me, but I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. And welcome to the very first of our Compost Conversation webinar series. It's a monthly series that will be running the second Tuesday of each month from now through November at noon. So, sort of a lunch and learn webinar series. These will be recorded and then posted on the Composting Conversations webpage, but also on our website under topics. So just so folks can find that. And I want to thank all of our sponsors without whom we wouldn't be able to put this on. So huge thanks to all the folks you see here on the list. If you are potentially interested in becoming a sponsor, you can reach out to me directly or learn more at compostingvermont.org, join #sponsors. And then today we're joined by Ben Gauthier, and we're going to be digging into the draft solid waste management rules, what's changing, and what it means for Vermont organic management systems. ANR hosted their public meeting last night at 6, and so there was a little bit of interesting conversation there. It was, of course, much broader than just the organics piece. But we're looking forward to a robust conversation today. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And maybe I did receive some of the questions. Folks were able to submit questions in advance. So I have some of those, but I'd like to start maybe by inviting Ben to give an overview and introduce yourself. I think many people know you, but we do have some folks from out of state. So that might be nice, Ben, if you could just give a short introduction and we'll get into it. I think we're going to be, you could certainly put anything in chat if you want me to ask your questions for you. You can raise your hand. If you raise your hand on your camera instead of the virtual Zoom hand raise, make sure your camera is on or I won't see you. With that, yeah, Ben, please.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. Thanks for having me. Happy to kick off the Compost Conversation series. This is the first one for the summer. And just a quick plug for you. I mean, with CAB is such an active group in Vermont Organics Management, from the policy to getting, on-site community composting at the community garden set up. If any of the folks on the call are interested in supporting CAB, please reach out to Natasha for either fundraising or volunteering opportunities. There's tons of ways to help. And I've always appreciated the work that CAB does in Vermont over the 20 years I've been doing this work. So just a little plug for you all there.
Thanks.
My name is Ben Gauthier. I work in the solid waste management program here at Vermont DEC. I've been here for close to 20 years now, and over the course of my career, sort of evolved into sort of the organics management role here. So if a permit comes in the certification section where I work, that involves composting or depackaging or anaerobic digestion, I tend to be the lead on that. And so I've just been working closely with those facilities in the state over the years. So this draft rule that we're about to talk about today, I mean, the solid waste rules cover a lot of ground in terms of solid waste management in Vermont. And actually, we're unique and there are two programs tucked into the solid waste rules. So there's the solid waste management program where I work, but there's also the residuals program, which deals with, domestic sewage wastes and biosolids and things of that nature that are tucked also into the solid waste rules. So I will talk today about the organics management changes in the solid waste program, and some of the things that we have currently in the draft rules that we've proposed. And this is a really timely time to be speaking with folks because, like Natasha said, we just had our public informational meeting last night, and the public comment period is open through June 19th. So if there's anyone that has comments or things that we may have missed or overlooked or that we didn't quite get right in the rules, please send the comments to me either by email or you can call and I can jot it down if it's a simple one, whatever's more convenient for you. But the public comment period is open through June 19th, and we'll be taking public comments from everybody, and then we'll respond to them. And sometimes we revise the solid waste rules based on what we receive. So encourage anyone to participate in that. So what I'll do is real quickly kind of run through some of the major changes that we have proposed, and then maybe we can just go to like a Q&A style thing. I always like to start out with that what sort of catalyzed the rule changes that we're proposing. And it kind of all comes back to, for those of us in Vermont, Act 170, which was passed in 2022. It was geared centrally around depackaging. And so there was a depackager stakeholder group that met for many months and then prepared a report of recommendations. And that included stakeholders from all kinds of different industry sectors. So there was composters, there were folks from the state ag program, there was depackager operators, there was AD representatives there. So they all had a seat at the table. And basically they came up with recommendations, not always singing in unison, right? Because there might be some conflicting angles there, but they came up with a report of recommendations, which were basically folding into the rules. So we've taken those recommendations and we've made some changes to the rules from that. The other two key things about Act 170 that bear mentioning is that we were required to write rules for depackaging. So that required us to open up our rules at some point in time and write rules that govern depackaging, which is why we have some depackaging related stuff in these draft rules. And lastly, it implemented a moratorium on depackaging in the state. So we couldn't issue the certification for a new depackager or for expansion at an existing depackager until we wrote rules that govern the practice. So that's kind of what we're trying to do with these draft rules. So some of the major changes that folks would see, and I should point out before I dive into it that we have a web page on our solid waste management program website that has the clean version of the rules, the red line version of the rules, so you can see where all the changes are made. And we also prepared, I think it's a 4-page summary sheet that goes through all the solid waste related changes and all the residuals, the biosolids related changes in the rules, kind of a high level summary that is pretty handy for folks. So I encourage you to check that out. That web page will also have updates about, the public meeting that we just had and also any other updates that we want to have. So I encourage people to check there. So some of the new definitions that we realized we needed and we're proposing now is a definition for mechanical depackaging, as you can imagine, because our rules previously didn't have anything about that. Packaged food. So we have a definition for packaged food now, and then we have a definition for depackaged food. Those are all critical because it seems simple and intuitive, but there's a lot of variation you can have in those subsets. When you talk to somebody like, does it mean this? Does it mean this thing? And you can come up with 1,000 different ideas that you're like, well, what does that mean? So we came up with definitions for those three things so that we could use them later on in the rules. The other two big things that I wanted to mention was that we included prohibitions. One of them is we have a prohibition on the commingling of manually source separated food residuals with packaged food. So currently, that is okay to do in the state. And we realize that has some issues, and the depackager stakeholder group recommended that the two streams not be commingled. So we have a prohibition proposed for that. Within that prohibition, we've understood that like the private industry that does the hauling is going to need some time to kind of adjust. So we've built in a window of time for that to roll out. But we do have that prohibition proposed. The second prohibition is treating manually source separated food residuals through a depackaging machine. So those source separated food residuals, the plate scraps and stuff, things like that, there's no package on them. They don't need to go through a depackager. They should be made available for their uses on the hierarchy as appropriate. And so that's kind of the two major prohibitions that we've proposed so far. One other major thing that we're including now, and we've already started rolling this out to a degree in some facilities, is load inspection programs. So we realized that a lot of times receiving facilities were being saddled with contaminants that were coming in their organic streams. And because it was dumped there, they just had to deal with it. And so what we're doing is we're working with the facility to design through the certification process and the facility management plan that they all have, to design protocols that they can all use to do random load checks when they go through. If there's 5 pieces of contamination, we're going to pick that, no harm, no foul. It's just incidental. We can deal with that. And if it's, maybe 20 or so pieces, it's getting a little bit too much. And then we can reach out to the hauler or the generator if that's known and just say, hey, we noticed you had an issue with that. Can we help you with some resources and knowing what to put in and what not to put in the bin? And then ultimately, if it gets to be a chronic issue where, a certain hauler or generator just isn't getting the message, then we have folks here at the state that can do education or outreach or even compliance follow-up if necessary. So with that, the understanding is that, the facility shouldn't have to be the bad person saying, hey, you dumped all this trash at my facility, clean it up way up. It's really a state law that folks need to be following. So the state wants to step in and take on some of that role where it's appropriate, in lieu of the facilities. And that kind of levels the playing field from facility to facility so that you can't, if facility X is giving you a hard time about your materials, you can go to facility Y who doesn't care so much and will take it from you with no penalty or even blowback. So we wanted to try to level that playing field. This is our attempt at doing that. And at the facilities that are implementing it already, it seems to be working pretty well so far. And then lastly, we have some operational requirements designed specifically for mechanical depackaging facilities. These are pretty rudimentary and basic stuff. I mean, it's kind of like if you have a pallet of material, taking the film wrap off before you send it through, taking the corrugated cardboard cartons out and recycling that, saving that for recycling, and then sending through the inner containers that need to be depackaged to the machine. So just basic stuff like that. And I think that's really it at a high level. I mean, without getting into too far into the details. So maybe I'll pause there, Natasha, and see if folks have any questions or anything about that.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That was a really good high-level overview. I did put Ben's email address in chat, so you all can have that. It's also, I think, on our website. And then I also dropped in links to the clean and annotated rules in the summary document. And Dan, thank you for putting in a link to the DPAC stakeholder group. That's helpful as well. So those are all great resources, and we'll capture those for the recording when that's shared out also. So as I said, we do have, I did receive a few questions in advance, but does anyone in the room have a question or a clarification or something to add before I look at those questions? And you can unmute or raise your hand or put anything in chat, however. Dan.
Thanks. And thanks, Ben, for joining us today. Really appreciate your time on this and all the work you've done to get the draft rules to the point where they are now. My question was something that was mentioned last night at last night's meeting that was new to me, or that I had not understood, and that is around what could happen for source separated organics that are commingled with packaged food, or source separated organics that might be commingled either at the point of generation or in hauling before they get to a receiving facility. I had not understood previously that these rules apply to all points along the way. So at let's say at a grocery store, in a haul truck, and then at the processing facility, be that a compost facility or a depackaging facility, or even a transfer station, I presume, that the rules will apply evenly throughout those. And whereas my understanding had been that source separated organics commingled could still go out of state, as they do now in large volumes for anaerobic digestion, that may not be the case if the rules go through as currently written, or at least ANR might have some enforcement capability to prevent that, or to make requests that would enforce the rules at those various points along the way, rather than just at the receiving facility. Can you
Yeah,
say more about
great
this?
question. So the way the rules are written, it starts at the point of generation and it carries on through hauler to facility, but in Vermont, right? So we don't have authority over out-of-state facilities. So basically, in that scenario, the generator is required to do the separating If they choose to outsource a depackaged portion, the streams have to be kept separate at the point of generation, separate hauling. In theory, those could go to the same out-of-state facility and be mixed because it's not in our jurisdiction. But they have to be handled separately. And then at a Vermont facility, they have to be handled separately. So it's a little weird with the state regulation and the borders and whatnot. But it is at the point of generation, so it applies to every generator, hauler, and facility in Vermont.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Any other questions from the room? While you're thinking about that, I'll ask one that we received in advance, and then we'll still have plenty of time. So, Ben, it'd be helpful if you could talk a little bit about A&R's position on contamination and acceptable feedstocks. So, I know there's sort of like the obvious, like, glass, right? Metal, those kinds of things. But when I was looking at the approved feedstocks for small facilities, which is referenced in the rules, it says really almost kind of nothing. And I can drop a link to that. I mean, it's basically like compostable material, bulking agents, like, it's pretty broad. Um, but the question was more around like, what about plastic coated, like the cartons, like milk cartons that are microplastic coated, or um, wax cardboard, glossy cardboards, things like that. Maybe uh, wood chips that might be from plywood or particle board, or that kind of, that we know aren't necessarily clean. And so the question was just, um, is there room for, whether it's in the rules or guidance or in things like this, approved feedstocks for small facilities? I imagine that also goes up to other facilities as well in general in terms of contamination. Is there room for A&R to play a stronger role in keeping things that might have microplastics or PFAS out of compost feedstock supplies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's, there are so many different streams that can come in to, let's just say, a composting facility in this example. And there's so many different generators involved with creating those streams. And, I'm a person in a building in Montpelier, so it's a little hard to have like direct oversight over any of that stuff. So what we've tried to do, at least, in my time here working with composters, is give the composters, the facilities themselves, sort of empower them to say, hey, there are certain things we don't want to take, right? We're not willing to take that risk. Educate them about, some of the potential risks of some of the streams at the same time. But also say it's okay. You don't have to take everything that people are offering you, if it's not something you want to do, and we can work with you on trying to vet some of those streams if we have resources to do that. But it can be very tricky because there's a lot of
Mhm.
chemical contaminants, for example. And even as we know from some of our microplastic research, it can be difficult. Some of the things you'd expect to find microplastics in, you don't. Some of the things that wouldn't expect, they might be showing up. So it's a pretty difficult world, and a very difficult thing to catch on the back end, right? So
Mhm.
my advice has always been, be as thorough and cautious as you can be on the front end, so it doesn't get into your system, into your composting at all. And then you don't have to worry about it coming through in the compost that you're selling or distributing or putting on your own property for that matter. And so that's kind of where it sits now. I think there was a push. I mentioned Act 170 before. There was a strong push from the legislature to require us to stand up some sort of regulatory sampling regime for both PFAS and microplastics. We don't think it's there yet. Our limited PFAS sampling that we've done on compost feedstocks and anaerobic digestate and DPAC was actually really promising, I thought. And the data set was pretty reliable. We're comfortable with the numbers we got there, and I think we're in pretty good shape from a PFAS standpoint. Microplastics is a much more difficult thing to sample for in organics because, as you can imagine, They want to glom onto anything. They stick to wet stuff. It's hard to separate them out from the organics in the lab when you're trying to analyze how many particles you got there. And they're minuscule, so they're really hard to count. I know when UVM was doing their research, they were actually running their samples in triplicate just to make sure, because things can be so heterogeneous between the three, even the same sample. So they're doing three areas and they were running it in triplicate and averaging that to get their numbers, which is like, it's great. It made their data more reliable, but it's also just sort of goes to show how difficult it can be to sample for these things. If you grab from this portion of the pile, you might have sky high microplastics. If you grab from over here, you might not have any, you know what I mean? And so, or lower numbers anyway. So all that to say is, we're trying to, we understand the importance of clean feedstocks in the end resulting products. So either anaerobic digestates that are being land applied or reused, or compost that are being reused. But I don't think we have interest in standing up a sampling program, right now that the labs can't support, like that the commercial labs that couldn't take the same sample, send it to two labs and get the same results or close to the same results. Because right now it's kind of the Wild West and we get wildly different numbers and they're not reliable, they're not repeatable. So to me, that's not a good recipe to require sampling. So I'm sorry, I'm probably rambling a little bit from your little original question, Natasha, but you're right. There's nothing that says you cannot accept XYZ.
Mhm.
But we do require folks through the application process at the point of certification, to say what kind of materials they're going to be taking, and we work with them then. And that's an ongoing conversation with many composters in the state of, hey, what do you think about this material or this
Mhm.
product from this generator? What do you know about it? So that kind of work doesn't stop. It's always ongoing, I would say.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that, and you provided a lot of helpful context there. I do wonder if you do this, or if this might be something that Cav could partner on. You said that you often have conversations of like, like, oh, this feedstock or that, or what we know. Like, is that like, I can imagine a number of people who I work with who would love like a cheat sheet, like it not exhaustive, not in rules, not hard requirements, but like, what do we know, right? Like, do we, like what if we're already have looked into some things, um, it might, sort of like an FAQ-ish type of thing, like, anyway, that's a different
Yeah.
idea that maybe I'll pull that thread with you
Yeah.
later, but I tend to have the same conversations with folks repeatedly, and I'm always thinking like, let's just not start the conversation from the very beginning each and every time. Um, we did get a question in chat in terms of certified compostables being allowed as feedstocks or not, and they are allowed. Ben, you're welcome to elaborate on this, but this goes to Ben's point about different facilities making different decisions. So I believe there are 4 facilities that I know of that accept compostable feedstock, compostable products right now. Plates, cups, flatware, whatever, and the rest do not, but it is not prohibited. Ben, is anything to
Yep.
add to that?
Yeah, we leave it up to the composter's discretion there.
Hmm.
Some of them are closed loop systems, so they have more control over them. Like there's a college, Middlebury College, for example, does their own composting and they have control over the products they buy and are used in the cafeteria. So that's a little bit safer, but it can be problematic, as we know with they're certified is one thing, but it can be the Wild West with compostables, and people think they're buying a good thing and it may not be. So we always leave it up to the composter's discretion, but we work with them on sort of assessing the risks that may or may not be involved with certain feedstocks. But ultimately kind of leave it up to them.
Yep, great, thank you. Any other questions from the room or follow up? And
I
you
have a
can
question.
oh yeah, please.
Um, it's Kat Buxton. Just following up on that with the compostables, I noticed. Thanks for posting the link, Natasha, to the approved feedstocks. And so would those be considered then bulking agents?
Interesting.
Because there's 5 things listed in the acceptable materials. and it must be that those are considered bulking agents.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a bit of a nuanced question. I think it's, I think more about the compostable plastic liner bags, where it's kind of like an accessory. You know, a lot of folks see it as an accessory to composting, so we kind of allow it there. The feedstock acceptance list is for the small composters under the ACPs. So it sort of streamlines things of like, hey, if you're gonna have this really streamlined and short and sweet kind of permitting registration process, here's the materials you can take. And there's sort of not a ton of wiggle room there. For the mediums and larges, we have a lot more flexibility on the things that we allow for feedstock acceptance there. We work with them quite a bit closer.
Okay, yeah, it's not super clear
Yeah,
on
it's
that
an old
link.
document too, so
Ah,
it probably could use some revision, huh?
that would be great. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
And that exists outside of rule. Is that correct, Ben? So that's something that could be updated independent, like in a different mechanism, government mechanism than the
Yep.
rules.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So the way that we can update that at any time and it doesn't impact the rules themselves, and we don't have to go through the same rulemaking process.
Yeah. Great. Carolyn, one, I just want to say, Nora, I see your request for a link to the certification program. I'll try to find that. Um, and we can talk about that a little bit. But Carolyn, go ahead and feel free to unmute and ask your question or comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natasha. Let's see if I can keep it concise, and I don't want to put us too much on a stray here, but I guess some side topics I'm interested in both have to do with like land application. There was this bill that didn't really move any further, 303, this biennium on kind of phasing out the land application of sewage sludge. And maybe the question there is like, is there appetite within DEC to possibly address that within this revision of the solid waste management rule? And the other question also about land application, just about the slurries from depackaging. I think they're defined now. That I think the term you use is a different one, not slurries, but in how far the solid waste rule sort of defines end uses of the slurries, and if there may be the lessons learned from sewage sludge, if there's maybe, at least on that regard, a greater appetite to really regulate, sort of speak, end users and mitigate possible soil contamination risks from just the slurries.
Yeah, two great questions. I don't want to punt on the biosolids one, Caroline, but that's a separate program that I don't work in, so it's I'm a little bit out of my wheelhouse to answer that one. But I do believe they're trying to implement sampling that allows them to keep land application open when it's appropriate. So some of the PFAS standards that they're implementing allows that. Not for every sludge, because some of them might not meet that standard. So I think they're trying to keep that option open, but it might be a better question for Eamon and Josh Burns in the residuals program. But as far as the digestates that are land applied from solid waste digesters, we've got, currently there are 4 facilities in Vermont that have solid waste certification, 4 anaerobic digesters that have a certification from us. 3 of them are connected to a municipal wastewater treatment plant. So the liquids go to a municipal wastewater treatment plant. And the solids from those facilities are typically brought to, I think they're all currently being brought to farms in the state, either for direct land application or other management on farms. The third facility, both the liquid portion is land applied on a farm, and the solids, it's more of a concentrated nutrient cake, because they have a dissolved air flotation treatment process that pulls a lot of the nutrient out. And that stuff is shipped, I think currently to New York State for management at sort of like a engineered soils location. So they kind of use it as a blend to make some engineered topsoil stuff. So that's currently where the solid waste digestates are going. And I don't remember if you were on the call initially, Caroline, but we were sort of talking earlier about how certain things can be a little difficult to sample for. And so we're kind of getting into a place where there might be things, there might be risks or concerns with some of this stuff, but it might be hard to verify whether or not they're present or absent, which kind of puts us in a tricky spot. And so what we're focusing on primarily now, like we're focusing on keeping things as clean as possible, working with depackager operators to say, what are things that maybe shouldn't go through here? You know, like what is something that if you put it through here, it creates so much residue in the organics that it's just not worth it. Maybe we should just cross that off the list and allow that to go to disposal rather than try to depackage it and make a mess out of everything. And so we're sort of working on a list there to kind of, you know, just sort of the no-fly list, kind of, for lack of a better term. But all that being said, there definitely are concerns. I mean, what we know about microplastics and things that can be mixed in with them for different performance benefits or different, there can be all kinds of chemicals added for different characteristics, and we don't have oversight over that and control over that. So it's difficult. So we are definitely concerned about it, trying to figure out how that path forward, like how to thread that needle between being cautious and protective, but also sort of reusing that resource. It's kind of a fine line. So we're still finding that path to a large degree, but we're always working closer to that. I know it's not a great answer and probably not the one you're looking for, but it's kind of what I found to be the sweet spot that makes the most sense until we can get a sampling program with actual standards and thresholds set up, which takes a bit.
Yeah, that's helpful. It seems like that's where it's hung up on. So that's really helpful to understand. Thank you.
Yeah, and so for the biosolids specific, Josh Burns is the person there. He is actually going to be joining us in September for a Compost Conversation webinar, but that of course is after the public comment for the rules, which again is a week from tomorrow, Friday, June 19th. So if folks have specific questions about that program and those recommended changes, I definitely recommend that you reach out to Josh in advance, and I'm sure either Ben can put you in touch or I can grab his email address as well, I'm sure. Let's see, we've had a bunch of other questions come in. Just before we leave the biosolids, I'll ask you this one, Ben, and then you can just say, you can just point to Josh or you can answer it if you're able to. So in the summary document, there's a removal of the requirement for biosolids to be labeled with MPK levels and to be registered as fertilizer. Do you know the reason for that, or is that a Josh question?
It might be better to ask Josh. I do know, however, that they still do need to be registered with the Agency of Agriculture. The NP, if there's I'm forgetting the term of art they use, but if there's a guarantee or some sort of assurance that it will increase plant growth or, has XYZ nutrients in it, then it has to go and be registered with the Agency of Ag. So maybe they're just trying to remove redundant, between the two agencies having the same requirement, but it might be a better question to ask Josh and Eamon.
Yeah, and it might be captured now under the Agency of Ag, like Ben said, but Josh or Eamon would be the folks to ask for that. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead. I had a hard time putting my hands on the exact link, Ben, so I'm going to just read Nora's question, and maybe you can address it while I look for the link. Is there a direct link to the certification program you referenced for the different facilities, and does that go into effect when the rule is finalized? And Nora, feel free to unmute, but were you talking about the deep packaging facilities or the compost facilities in particular?
Sure. Excuse me. I was talking, Ben, how you were saying about the a certification process.
Mm-hmm.
I got the understanding that could be composting facilities like Green Mountain has, or it could also be the DPAC facilities, but I'm not certain. But it's specific to that load inspection or load tracking.
Yeah, great question. And hi, Nora. Good to see you. So the all solid waste management facilities in Vermont have to have a certification from us. So the transfer stations, the landfills, the recycling centers all have certifications, as do the organics management facilities. So that's kind of what I meant when I used the term certification. So any anaerobic digester that takes solid wastes. So if it's a farm digester and it only does farm waste, they're out of our certification program. But if they import any food scraps or depackaged food or any of that stuff, they would need a certification from us. The depackager that's currently operating in the state has a certification from us, as do all the compost facilities that take solid waste that aren't under the farm exemption. So there's a farm exemption. If you're farm-based, there's an out where you wouldn't need a permit from us to take under 2,000 cubic yards. But everyone else would have a certification from us, which includes an application process. And we go through a facility management plan, which kind of governs a lot of the operational protocols that, are critical. Recipe mixes, the load auditing program, that's kind of where that would be tucked. And it varies, as you can imagine, from the size of the facility. Larger facilities may have more resources. The smaller facilities might have one person, kind of covering a shift here and there, and be largely absent for part of the week. So we've had to work with the facility on a case-by-case basis based on what's coming in, who's bringing it in, where it's coming from, to kind of tailor those load inspection programs to something that works for them and is also effective. So it's been working really well, I think, actually. And I'm pretty proud of how much heavy lifting we've got done with just the few facilities we've implemented that at so far.
Excellent. So it's in effect now.
Well, we started rolling it out because there was some old provisions under the facility management plan stuff about contaminant removal. And so we kind of took some liberties, but through this draft solid waste rule, we've kind of bolstered it a little bit and made it more uniform across all organics management facilities to kind of level the playing field. So it's kind of just bolstered, but we've been implementing it for, I think, since the DPAC stakeholder group process wrapped up. So probably the last 3 years, anyone that's come in for amendment or renewal in that time frame has implemented one.
Okay. And real fast follow up, I'm thinking of a digester like the one at Goodrich Farms that I think gets slurry from Vanguard's operations in Massachusetts. That you can control, right? In terms of an audit.
Harder and messier, but we're working on some things. So they use there's a technology that Vanguard technology, use that term loosely, but they use it's called a trash rack. And it's basically, so if you have a tanker truck that comes in that basically has a rack that's not too fine mesh, but has some bars there to catch major particulate. And if they see a lot of it, they can shut it off and just say, hey, take this out of here. Or if there's a lot kind of coming in at the tail end of a load, because sometimes, plastics can float. And so it takes some time, and then you'll have them all kind of shooting out at the very end, and they might shut it off and say, you're going to take the rest of this somewhere else. So that's one of the technologies that's being used currently by Vanguard, just as a screening tool. It's not perfect, but it does offer some sort of visual feedback on, is there rubber gloves that we're seeing come through here, that we don't want in here, and they can always shut it off right then and there to prevent more. So harder to do for sure, but not impossible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a bunch of questions in chat, and Dan just raised his hand, but we also received a question in advance that is a little bit related to the exemption piece that you mentioned just now, so I'm going to fold that in. So on page 125, section 6-1103, so very specific, under the exemptions, there's still an exemption for the 1,000 cubic yards of food processing residuals on farms. And so the question is, how does this interplay with the rules, or the Act 41 allows for up to 2,000 cubic yards for on-farm importation. And so that was just flagged, and just people, again, still, as you know, confused about the lack of clarity between the Agency of Ag and the Agency of Natural Resources as it pertains to on-farm composting.
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is I messed up. I forgot to update that. So we already have that on our list of things to adjust for the draft rules going forward, just to make that particular exemption match the Act 41 from, was it 2020, 2019? I forget what it was, language. Yep. So that is something that we will be updating.
So it'll be updated just to 2,000, and then it'll match.
Yeah, and I'm going to pull in the language about principally used on the farm and the
Yep.
poultry. I'm going to just copy that language and paste it, or maybe
Okay.
just cite it. I don't know how we'll do it yet, but we do need to update that. It's one of those things that happened so long ago. It wasn't even on my mind when I was doing these draft rules, and I just completely missed it. So
Fair
you'll
enough.
have that sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. And it has been sort of a moving target. All right. I'm going to ask a couple questions before letting you ask your question, Dan, if that's okay. Just that came in from chat a while ago. So back to depackaging facilities. How are you defining outer packaging that is required to be minimally removed? Manually removed before mechanically depackaging products. I'm going to tag on a question to that that's similar that I received in advance about this. I think during the depackaging stakeholder time frame, there was conversation around lightly packaged, heavily
Yes.
packaged, like those terms were being thrown around. And so that's a little bit of the same in terms of what is the outer packaging? What is actually being required? Is it just the film and the cardboard, or does it go beyond?
Yeah, so I think this is going to be one that we're going to have to kind of find the sweet spot on. And I think the way we approached it, and you mentioned sort of the lightly and heavily packaged language that we had in a previous version of a policy revision. But it got so into the weeds that ultimately, I think, management in our division was just kind of like, let's just make it simple, cut and dry. If it's packaged, then it's packaged. We don't need the light and heavy. But I intend to develop some resources that kind of encourage generators to just say, something simple. If it's a clamshell with a piece of cheesecake in it, you know what I mean? Like technically it's packaged, right? But how hard is it to just pop it open and put the cheesecake in a food residuals bin and recycle the clamshell if it's recyclable. So unfortunately, that's kind of one of the areas where I wish we were doing a little more, you know what I mean, in that realm. But I mean, you remember, Natasha, that policy was many pages long. It was not concise. It was very difficult to get all the nuance of what's lightly packaged and what's heavily
Mhm.
packaged, even though intuitively it kind of makes sense in your brain of like what a heavily packaged item is. To define it is very difficult. So we went this route with the understanding that we can always revise it and move the needle in either direction if we need to. But that's kind of where we landed for this go around. Was there a second part to that question?
I think that covered it. It was
Oh, you mentioned the depackaging manually.
defining the outer packaging.
Yeah.
Is there a definition of outer packaging?
There isn't, and that's goes back to sort of that reason of like how difficult it can be to define some of those things. But basically where we wanted to draw the line is removing everything that's either recyclable and has value, because as you know, there's also a mandated recyclable list that things that cannot be disposed of. So trying to recover as much recyclables as possible from some of these streams. But then also we have a caveat about removing things that would be detrimental to the depackaging operation, because some things, might bind up on the equipment or reduce, plug screen pores and things like that and just cause all kinds of, headaches. And so we're focusing mostly on the operation of things now and doing as much as we can with this preliminary step. And then maybe working closely with the depackager operators to kind of fine tune some of those things. Because so much of it is operational, right? Like there's so much of, the performance of a depackager that's operational, how fast the paddles are spinning in the machine, how much manual separation you've done, how the augers are kind of slicing the material as it gets fed in. All these things play into it. How much liquid wash water you might be rinsing through at any given time. So it's kind of, I mean, it's very much an art as much as it is a science. So we're just trying to get them to recover as much recyclables. Outer film wraps, is an easy one that doesn't need to go through at all. There never seems to be a good time for that to go through. And then getting it as close to the principal packaging around the food as possible. It may not be perfect, and we might have some headaches that we encounter as a result of it, but it seemed like a good first step. And to be honest with you, here in Vermont, we're kind of lucky, I think, compared to a lot of places in the nation where I think our food scraps are generally pretty clean on the whole. There are pockets where that might not be true. And I think that just from working with the depackager that's currently in operation in the state, they're actually doing a really good job of doing this already. Like a lot of things are being opened by hand. So it's kind of amazing how much staff time is going into that currently at the current facility. So yeah, there's a lot to it. But I don't know that we just didn't think that having a definition for how far things had to be manually separated. I felt like it might be more harmful than good, essentially. So we're trying to find that sweet spot again. But yeah, it's a
Yeah,
good thing to
once you
ponder.
start a list, there's always something that you won't think of. It's
Yeah,
tough to enumerate. Yeah.
yeah, and that's the truth. I'm notorious for oversights like that.
Yeah. Dan, I see you put your question in chat, but it's related to Deepak as well. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and just ask it, or I can read
Yeah,
it too,
sure.
but
And one of my reasons for asking it is I am very curious about the Vermont perspective, but I know a lot of other states have been reaching out to and are very interested in tackling what to do about depackaging within their own rules. And so this one is particularly curious to me how if these rules are promulgated as written and then potentially adopted or by other states looking to do something similar, how it might play out there. So specifically the prohibition of source separated organics going through a depackager, and the exception that's listed within the draft rules that says that if no other options exist in the state of Vermont, source separated food residuals may be approved for treatment by mechanical depackaging so long as public health risk and environmental risks are met. So I'm curious, a bunch of things around that, like Vermont is a rural state with interesting geography. Does a depackager need to check in with every facility within the bounds of that state? Can they ignore ones that are 2 miles over the border in any direction when making this determination? And also, yeah, what defines the public health and environmental risk when making that determination?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've gotten a lot of questions about this one little sort of out, I would say. And I would say it's a little difficult to fully bake it, but the concept behind it is, if there's a scenario where there's maybe a massive amount of food that's going bad or something, and there's a risk to public health or the environment as a result of it, and it just needs to be dealt with really quickly in a hurry, then maybe the best thing for it is to quickly get sent through a depackager and offsite, to a digester or something like that. So that's kind of what we were thinking, just as an emergency provision of like, okay, we need to do something with this quick, otherwise there could be an outbreak or something, who knows? And so the other piece was added that Dan mentioned about if there's no capacity in the state, and that was it's a little bit different than the emergency provision for public health risk or environment risk to the environment, in that it's sort of like, well, what if the industry or the economics of things get to a point where it's just like there's no other options around, and maybe it makes sense at that point in time to just say, okay, if no one is willing to take this, then maybe we can approve a load to go through DPAC. So that was the concept there. And in terms of how that would be implemented and how we'd be reviewing all that stuff, like I think we always envisioned it as a case by case basis. It wouldn't be something that's like, we approve it once and it's a blanket approval kind of thing. So it's not a permanent way to circumvent that prohibition. It would just be on a case by case basis, an emergency basis that we would review and approve. I mean, we do that currently. We do that now for bacterial contaminated foods, like because there's a disposal ban on food residuals, right? But if there's bacteria on it and no one wants to take it, then we always write approvals for it to be disposed of. So that's already kind of happening to a degree, and we're pretty comfortable with it. And this is a kind of an extension of that, I would say. I don't know if that answers your question, Dan.
It does. Quick follow-up, like
Yep.
instead of bacterial contamination, what if the contamination is plastic, and that this load of source separated organic collected
Yeah.
restaurants and schools it's so contaminated that when they bring it to compost facility A, B, C, and then D, and they all say, well, this has got too much contamination in it. I don't want that in my facility. Is that justification for them saying, like, hey, we tried, but hey, what do you know? We do have our own depack and we could clean that right
Yeah.
up.
It's a good question. That's a very real thing that happens now at facilities, right? I would say no. I would say that's not a reason to do depack. I think that would trigger the load inspection protocols that we talked about earlier, and it would involve, opening a conversation with the hauler or the generator. Maybe the state would get involved if necessary, and then if it becomes a chronic thing, where maybe it would be a compliance or an enforcement issue that we would pick up on. And we've also allowed for some of that stuff to be disposed of because the facility doesn't need to be saddled with, gross contamination just because they're a composter that's managing materials, right? Same thing for digesters. So we've kind of allowed for, on a case by case basis, if it's flagged and we start a conversation where we're trying to educate on the correct source separation requirements and doing it correctly, then maybe that load is best destined to be disposed of. And we start the conversation and work on doing a better job going forward. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. Yeah, it can be difficult, right? Because we know festivals and things like that can be difficult because there's a large amount of organics and it's a population that doesn't necessarily know the rules or care about the rules, right? So there's always sort of categories that kind of bear thinking about and discussion. But in terms of that provision, I think it's case by case emergency basis. So pretty rare, I would imagine.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
Great. And I just can't help myself because you mentioned events. Our November one is going to be specifically around community engagement for really good source separation at events. So if that's a favorite topic for folks, be sure to tune in for that one. Okay, we have two more questions, and then I think we have time for that. Serge, you had a question about criteria for digesters receiving depack sludge from out of state. Do you want to elaborate on that at all? Or, yeah, go ahead.
Well, mostly it seems that obviously there's different rules, which all make sense for depackaging operation there in Vermont. But if the depackaging is done out of state there, what is the level of control of, let's say, AD on farm receiving just truckloads of materials there, like guidance requirements that the receiving facility needs to have on the material received to demonstrate that it doesn't contain too much debris or plastic or something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I'll be honest with you. It amazes me a little bit how far some of these depack slurries can travel. Like I wouldn't think that it would make sense from an economic standpoint for how far some of this waste moves because it's so heavy. But we are seeing that currently where there is at least one depackager that's located out of state that brings to a Vermont facility. So we're working with, I have a good relationship with that out of state depack as well. And I've been down there and talked to them quite a bit about it. But we're working on potentially adding conditions to the certification because it is more of a case by case thing. And I don't know how much that'll come up that it, may not necessitate rules around it. But it might be a case by case thing where we include provisions in the certification that would govern it to a degree. But at this point, I don't know that it's something we're super concerned about, but we are following it pretty closely. So it's, TBD. It might change. Who knows? But yeah, that is. And currently, there's not too many depackagers located regionally that service Vermont facilities, as far as I'm aware of. Just that one in Massachusetts that I can think of.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the question is, even the summary of the proposed rules feels pretty confusing. Is there any plan to create a user-friendly guide to help develop a clean stream for our haulers and local compost processing facilities? I'm envisioning something for generators to be able to follow.
Clean stream meaning
I think the clean source SSO, so effective SSO. I think this might dovetail a little bit with that guidance on following the hierarchy and how do we work up, but that's my take on it. What do you want to jump in on that? Is there going to be a a
Well,
guide?
it's one of those things. I mean, we do have resources on what to separate out for organics, but it gets a little tricky because it might vary based on the receiving facility. So I think we've always felt like it's not really a space for us to jump into because there might be some differences between the facility. And if we put something down on paper, then we're saying this is the right way to do it or the way we want you to do it, and it might, disagree with some of the facilities. So I think we've kind of stayed away from that intentionally. Um, but if there's confusion, I'm trying to figure out where the confusion is, just kind of having a one-stop shop kind of thing, or confusion in the way the rules are written. Um,
Maybe just for folks, and Kat, feel free to unmute and join. But I'm also just thinking, like this goes. These you've said that these rules are for generators, haulers, and facilities. So I think the many of us in the room, certainly haulers, like we're familiar with sort of winding our way through rules.
mhm,
Generators at large may not be.
okay.
So how do you extend these rules effectively? This is now my question. I'm just
Yeah.
riffing off of Kat's, but how do you extend
You
these
got it,
rules,
Natasha. That's right.
okay, effectively to the generators who may not even know there's a rule, right?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So
I get it. Yeah, so that's a good one, and it's something that, like, when Act 148 passed, I feel like we did so much outreach that we're like, okay, we're done now, and like we're realizing now that there is no done. Like you just got to continually do it over and over and over in perpetuity. But I want to point out that we do have, so there are some requirements in the state materials management plan that require the solid waste management entities to do some outreach to generators on a rolling basis. And we also have folks here in our program that do that outreach, and they've been doing a great job, just kind of cold stopping into generators around the state, and just asking about their organics management and how they're doing. And sometimes there'll be a bin there, that's full of food scraps. Sometimes there'll be a bin there that's not being used. And so like there's all these conversations that are going on, from the state direct to the generator, and also from the solid waste management entity to the generator, to kind of keep that conversation continual. Obviously restaurants change hands, so maybe some people just didn't know the requirements, but it's an opportunity for, every so many years, every generation should be getting a visit, and be hearing the message. So I think that's one way that it's happening continually. We've done media campaigns in the past. And so that's another way that we've gotten the word out. So there's a lot of these ways to get the message out there. But in terms of one resource that says, here's what you can include in the bin, I don't know that we have that generated yet, but I feel like that exists already, right? Like don't those exist either probably on CAB's website? Do you have one, Natasha, that exists there that could be
for
used?
like
Like,
what to put in the food scrap bin
right.
versus
Yeah.
what?
Is that something
Yeah.
that
So I mean,
feels
to
like
your
that
the
exists already, but
Yeah, to the point that you made before, it's a little bit tricky, I think, from a state perspective, because different haulers and different, depending on where haulers are taking the material, different compost facilities around the state have different rules around what they
right.
accept. So I remember when I first started with CAP, I was like, why isn't there just a state campaign? Well, like, depending on where you are, and even not necessarily where you are, but where your hauler is transporting the material to, what's allowed and isn't is different. And so I think so that does exist in we certainly work with more even large scale but community oriented composting, on farm composting around the what you take and what you don't take. But it is definitely something that I think needs to be in partnership, state facilities and haulers, to do the outreach to the generators, because it really does vary.
Mm.
And it can be very confusing, especially when people live in one jurisdiction and work in another, and then what they're allowed to do at home is different than what they do at work, and things get mixed up. Um, so that may, unfortunately, not be a very satisfying answer, but I do think that there's always, like Ben said, this is iterative. There's always work to be done, And I do get the sense sometimes that A&R feels like they've checked the box. So Ben, it's glad to hear you say that you
I
recognize
felt
that and
that for a long time, and that was
the
wrong.
need to
Yeah.
continuously it's communication and outreach, right?
Yeah.
It's iterative. We just have a minute left. I do want to just wrap up by making sure folks understand the timeline. That like what happens to the rules from here. And so they're open for public comment now. Comments are due by a week from tomorrow, June 19th. And then the different, Ben, you could probably summarize
Yeah.
it
Yep.
better than me,
So
what happens next.
when the comments come in, we gotta kind of crunch them, review them. Oftentimes they result in some change or tweak to the rules. So we basically come up with one big document that says, here's the comment we received, here's our response to it, here's how the rule changed or didn't, we're not recommending a change. And then when we get through that process, we gotta, make the changes to the draft rules. And at that point, we can file with it's a committee called LCAR, which is kind of the last step in the rulemaking process in Vermont. They do a review. Sometimes there's a back and forth with us. But at that point, if they give it the stamp of approval, then we can go ahead and finalize them. And so then at that point, the only thing that would be left to do is to repeal any lingering policies. So the policy on management of packaged food would have to be repealed after these rules go through, if they go through as they're currently drafted. So that's kind of the steps that we got to go through. We anticipate that all happening, by fall. It's always hard to kind of ballpark because some of this can have multiple back and forths that might take extra weeks. But we think this fall we should be through the process and have a final new rule set. So yeah, please get your comments in. If there's anything that we missed or anything you think we should include, please send them to me before next Friday.
Great. Thank you all so much for participating. Good conversation. Just a reminder that if you haven't registered for the other lunchtime lunch and learn webinar series, you can still do that. They're all on our website, and there's a link even just right from the homepage, so you don't have to worry about finding a specific link. And thanks once again to all of our sponsors who are really making this whole series possible. So without your support, we couldn't do it. So thanks again so much. And Ben, thank you for making the time. We really appreciate it, and all the dialogue and back and forth. It's really helpful, I think, for the community to have such nice access to you and to the
Yeah,
program.
absolutely. Happy to do it. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, everyone, so much. See you next time.
Thanks,
Thank you.